I was frustrated when I first started to learn about blockchain tech. And at the time, the narrative that, oh, everything is anonymous was still very prevalent. And like coming at it from a cyber and a tech background, I recognized like this technology is not made for privacy. It is made for auditability and data integrity. In fact, it's the absence of identity being built into it because it supports finance that made it so scary to people.
Welcome to the What Kind of Internet Do You Want podcast, Carole. Thank you so much for making the time.
Absolutely thrilled to be here and chat with you, Amy.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's kind of a different one for me. So before we get into things, do you want to just give everybody a brief background on who you are and what it is you do in Web3?
Yeah, absolutely. My current role is interesting. I'm an executive in residence at Terranet Ventures. We're an interesting mix of research and advisory service with venture capital firm that focuses on supporting different projects that invest in security type technologies. So whether that support is through operational support, research and advisory services, or direct investment, that's what we do at Terranet. I'm also serving as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is a think tank in DC, and I'm on advisory boards for a few different regulatory agencies at the federal and state level, and working with some other nonprofits on issues like U.S.-China competition and geopolitical issues related to emerging tech. So I've spent most of my career though in government. I'm afraid kind of a patchwork quilt of different national security issues. I started in the Army as a chem bio rad nuclear defense officer. That might sound really cool, but it's the gas mask stuff that is not everyone's favorite thing to deal with. And then I was a collection manager, managing all the assets that watch and listen to people in the intelligence field. After that, I got into hard cybersecurity. My first tour in the White House at the Office of Management and Budget, overseeing federal civilian agency cybersecurity. I did the same thing, supporting Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. And then I went over to Treasury to hunt down cyber criminals with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And that's where I led policy for cryptocurrency, cyber, and identity issues. And then my last position in the government most recently was a stint with the White House National Security Council, where I was the director for cybersecurity and secure digital innovation. What that means, besides being a really long title, meant that I was driving efforts like the U.S. counter ransomware campaign, as well as being a key author in President Biden's executive order on ensuring responsible development in digital assets, as well as working on digital identity policy. So with all these spaces, I've liked to be where tech might be exploited by bad guys to hurt people. And recently that's been working on issues like cybersecurity. And when you get into cybercrime at Treasury, you inherently get into crypto. So it's been an interesting evolution, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's what most people in our audience will know you for best is the work you did on the executive order. And I definitely want to get into that. But before we do, I just wanted to get your general, like high level thoughts on crypto and on Web3. How do you think about it? How do you explain it to a more kind of mainstream person who would be, finding out about it for the first time?
Oh, that's a great question, because so many people do ask me about it, even whether I'm in cybersecurity spaces or other fields. There's a lot of people that don't understand crypto. They just still view it as pictures of gorillas or funny money, which I guess, from certain people's perspectives, I get that. But I'd say that my view is that certainly I think that blockchain technology and distributed ledger technologies are really, really interesting and present a lot of great potential promise in this space. A fascinating application of for security purposes, for supply chain and provenance and auditability, and data integrity. I was frustrated when I first started to learn about blockchain tech, and at the time the narrative that, oh, everything is anonymous was still very prevalent. And like coming at it from a cyber and a tech background, I recognized like this technology is not made for privacy. It is made for auditability and data integrity. In fact, it's the absence of identity being built into it because it supports finance that made it so scary to people. So this gets into why I think that DLT and Web3 is really interesting and very special. Rails that traditionally were bifurcated. So whether you're talking about Fedwire, chips, Swift, and financial infrastructure or the infrastructure of the internet, they were separate. Information transfer and value transfer running on different rails with different intermediaries and responsibilities. Now you have the exact same rails that can support both information transactions and financial transactions on the same rail, and with the same and with the right type of obfuscation, you can't tell which is in fact occurring, whether it's an information transaction or a value transaction. This is very interesting, and also very scary from a policy perspective, in the sense that we haven't really seen the technology or the policy landscape evolve necessarily to be able to address infrastructure that is supporting both simultaneously. I think it's both more of a technology issue actually than a policy issue writ large. But overall, the way that I explain cryptocurrency to people that don't know about it, I try to say, okay, imagine that you can send a wire transfer from my pocket to yours anywhere in the world, instantaneously, efficiently, and you don't need a bank in order to do it. But that also means that there's no protection that stops me from being in Iran and you from being in North Korea. So again, the features of these assets that do exist in the traditional finance space are now coexisting at the same time. So the ability for peer-to-peer activity that you get from cash and the ability to send lots of value cross-border and higher speeds-ish through wire transfers. The settlement systems we know take a much longer time, but with cash you get some of that. You get that immediate finality. All those features now exist simultaneously within crypto. The one benefit that you get, though, from an illicit finance mitigation perspective is that it's on a public ledger. SWIFT, Fedwire, chips, cash transactions are not published publicly. So with cryptocurrency, you can see a lot of that provenance and the destination. So those are normally the key features and elements that I point to for people that are trying to understand crypto in the first place, to understand why it's special, and why it could bring really great efficiencies and transform the financial system, but also why it's currently being exploited, and present some vulnerabilities for illicit actors. So hopefully that's helpful to kind of lay the groundwork for some of the base points that I lay out for people when I describe it.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me think of one of my favorite stories in crypto, when it comes to, nefarious use of it with, when Catherine Hahn was working in the government, she had this case where I think it was to do with Ross and the Silk Road. And there were some, right? Am I getting that right? Yeah. And there were some government actors that were involved in that who were doing things that were wrong. And she was able to prove it because they had gotten the admins of the websites that they used to like clean out their indexes, but the actual, like, she could still trace it in the blockchain. And I think that's just like really, I don't know, it's just like the perfect example of why this technology is so exciting and the potential good that it can bring.
Absolutely. And Katie's been a really strong voice and advocate. I know certainly when she was over at Andreessen and now with her own firm, she's doing a lot to try to invest in the space. So I'm glad that you brought her up in that particular case. That and others. And I know that some people call him like colloquially call him the crypto judge, or I'm sure that there's other terms for him. But Zia Faruqi, who was a prosecutor and is now a judge in DC, and he very publicly stated, and I know it got a lot of coverage when he did, highlighting the fact that the fact that cryptocurrency analytics capabilities, because of this largely immutable ledger and the traceability that's enabled through the information that's publicly available, as well as other data, has provided massive resources to the government to be able to then see where financial flows go. So law enforcement has that evolution of understanding of crypto and what is inherently vulnerable in it that enables it to be exploited, and then also its inherent features that enable it to counter that exploitation, has really evolved a lot in the narrative from law enforcement personnel in the government. So I've been happy to see that evolution.
Yeah, we are too, obviously, because I think that so one of the things that's commonly said on the, builder side is that the regulation through enforcement and the sort of murky regulatory landscape is this big problem. And I have heard you say in other interviews and stuff that you don't necessarily agree that there is as much ambiguity when it comes to regulation as a lot of people think. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
It's a wonderful point, and I'm glad that you care about it, Amy, on this, since I know that your audience is very technical on a lot of the devs and the people that are really creating and engineering in this ecosystem. And the policy discussions often get clouded and murky, in my view. So first, on the anti-money laundering framework in the U.S., which is the one that I came from, one that I was helping to administer over at FinCEN. And it's the first one where international standards were ever passed. And I was a part of the delegation for the US for that. That framework was set in place in the US since at least 2011, when we changed our definitions for money transmission to include acceptance and transmission of value substituting for currency. And then over a series of many instances and iterations of guidance, as well as enforcement actions, we've continued to offer more and more clarity, even with our first set of comprehensive guidance in 2013 that was really helpful, and is often pointed to in the industry as evidence of a regulator trying to give early guidance. And early regulatory guidance, I know that not everyone in industry understands that and feels that too early regulation can stifle or crush innovation. And I do understand that. Calibrating that bell curve right is so critical. And I do believe that regulation is a bell curve. There is a positive on driving consumer trust and benefits to help people actually feel that this system is secure and worthy of investment in or conducting activity in. But there is an apex and a point over which you're calibrating too conservatively and stifling what could be a really positive potential. But getting that calibration right is critical, I think, early also, because if you bring regulations a decade after a sector has existed, then you have very expensive retrofitting, and like you haven't given a North Star and guardrails to a sector. So I believe very much in the need for establishing those guardrails, especially where the activity that's happening is substantively similar and the risks are substantively similar or identical to what exists elsewhere, which in the case of money transmission, like a crypto exchange that's accepting value and transmitting value, it's got very similar risks to what Western Union and PayPal present and face. So in the US, I'd say that on the anti-money laundering side, there is a huge amount of clarity. I know that the greatest area of ambiguity that I feel exists also in implementation is really about entityhood and personhood, on when something is a person or an entity that then has responsibility imposed on it. And I'm sure that we'll get into that more. That's one of the core issues that was featured in a report that I was just a part of. But that is the hardest issue that I think still has to be addressed in AML. But other than that, anti-money laundering or AML regimes have been in place in the US since 2011. And then in 2019, at the international stage of the Financial Action Task Force, we adopted the first ever international standards for virtual assets, which were basically just putting the exact same obligations that exist on other types of financial institutions on crypto institutions where these intermediaries do exist. So for AML, I don't buy the argument that things are unclear. My frustration with AML is when other jurisdictions have not put in place any kinds of regulatory obligations, which is the case for most countries. And that's the greatest vulnerability that we have in illicit finance right now, I feel, for crypto. Outside of AML, though, which is where most of the calls for clarity come in, I understand industry's calls for wanting there to be a very specific and clear outline on when am I a security, when am I a commodity. It's very difficult for regulators, I think, to provide step-by-step answers for all facts and circumstance permutations. Instead, what they did was, like the SEC published in 2019, investment contract guidance with 40 factors for how they view something to fall underneath the Howey test, essentially, and determine whether a digital asset is viewed as an investment contract. I feel that in a lot of cases, the agencies have been as clear as they were able to be, except one area that I do find extremely frustrating has been lack of clarity on pathway to registration or to successfully operate in this space. This is something that I feel that the capital markets regulators and especially the SEC need to work on and address. And even the federal banking agencies, one of the a senior leader at the FDIC who just recently made a speech highlighting as much that the federal banking agencies need to work on providing clear guidance to their banking sector about how to deal with and manage the risks involving digital assets and blockchain, because right now they're essentially interpreting the position from the federal banking agencies as it's not even worth trying to participate in it, and that's a frustrating position when institutions that have understood how to mitigate some of the risks that the crypto sector has not really succeeded in addressing yet, things like cybersecurity and secure custody. That is something that banks have spent years learning a lot of lessons from. So I think that there's lessons as institutional players come to play and intersect with crypto, that they'll actually be able to help each other solve certain problems.
Mm.
On that clarity piece, I think that the pathway to registration is where most of the clarity needs to come from. And otherwise, I know that when I would engage with the trade associations, either as a regulator or at the White House, and highlighting that I'm not a securities lawyer, I would ask, like, please tell me the talking points. Give me clarity on the clarity that you are seeking. What specifically is not clear enough, other than the pathway to registration, which I think is a fair concern. And I never got an answer. So I'm sure there are people that have that answer. I just never got them ever. When I was in the positions that I was in. So there's an issue of advocacy from the right people across the industry
Mm.
that I think is also playing, at least from the seats that I was in.
Wow, that's really interesting to hear. And that makes sense. So at Web3 Working Group, we're really focused on the infrastructure side the of the Web3 movement. Right. I think that most of the nonprofit and advocacy organizations are focused more on the way that the technology can be applied to financial use cases. But
Mm.
the infrastructure side, and these are things like what's allowing us to be on this video call right now, file hosting, video transcoding, content indexing, all of the things that are responsible for the things that we do day in and day out on the web, access content, be on social media, right? Google things. Like those are the things that are, I compare it to the plumbing of the web, right? It's like the stuff that's like the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure that we actually rely on, but we never think about. It's just like happening in the background of our lives. We have those things on the web as well. And they're kind of controlled by like 5 companies right now, all of that infrastructure. And it's changed the web from the original vision of this sort of free and fair marketplace. It was decentralized, that was a tool for creativity and collaboration to I don't know exactly how to describe it. A very controlled
Yeah, I've heard it
space.
described as a technological oligopoly. I am not calling it that. I have definitely been in conversations where that was the
There you
term.
go. Yeah, yeah. I've also heard people call it like a company town, right? Like you're just like you buy all your stuff from the company store, you have to abide by all of the rules or you're out. Yeah, exactly. And so what we can do, some people are calling these decentralized physical infrastructure networks. There's a new acronym, of course, DPIN, to talk about this sector. But that by turning all of those services into decentralized networks that are both, run by the people that are using them and pushing that power out to the ends of the network, like we're, all hoping will happen again. Um, that has some regulatory questions that I guess haven't really been addressed. And that I guess now hearing from you haven't really been advocated for as much as they needed to be. We were getting started I think maybe we got started after the executive order came out, so that would make sense that we weren't able to talk to you about those things. But what do you have any thoughts around that area of it? Because I think that for us, that's definitely a place where there's a lot of kind of regulatory uncertainty because tokens are part of the orchestration of these networks, and there is inherent financial value to them because you're paying for a service or whatever it might be, or on secondary markets, you can trade them, but they're not intended for the purpose of being some sort of financial asset, right? Just because when you use dollars to buy something from Amazon Web Services, like, to put up your website for some cloud hosting or something like that, doesn't turn that into some sort of like financial product that Amazon is providing you. And it's almost the same thing when it comes to these networks. Just because you use a token to pay for the service doesn't turn that service into a financial product. You're still just paying for a service in a different means.
Yeah, I hear you, and I'm also really really glad that you're bringing this up. It's clear that that your podcast and your listeners are really focused on some of the nitty gritty on these issues, because this particular issue I don't feel gets enough airtime, certainly by policymakers and not by some of the policy-minded community, even though engineers often talk about wanting this to be viewed the same way that we do the internet. And I don't think that that's totally out of scope or out of bounds. This is where that the confluence of and the aggregation of now financial infrastructure with the tech and internet infrastructure come in and present an interesting policy challenge, but I think an even more interesting technological challenge, because I my general premise is that technology can solve policy problems. Like it will be able to do that. Coming to agreement around things like standards and best practices in an industry, especially a decentralized community that maybe has a hard time organizing, will be especially interesting to watch. And I think that standards efforts are going to set the groundwork for demonstrating what good governance can look like in a lot of these systems. I'll get into more of that in a second, but first on why on I know that a lot of the developers in this space, they come from an internet development. Some of them were some of the people involved in the first days of development of the internet. And they certainly come from an engineering and a tech background where they want the kind of practices and principles and regulations that are imposed in that space onto this technology. I would say that value transfer is always going to be different from information transfer. And this is where the fact that the tokens, when the tokens are specifically representing a payment instrument, like including payment to get access to a utility or service, when that token is meant to be the payment asset, it is very possible that that then would be viewed as a financial asset, because it is, right? Like there's like that is it is being used as a money or a currency substitute, as a medium of exchange. That's very tough in this ecosystem, especially because I feel that the digitization and tokenization of assets actually enables barter economies to become a thing at scale again. That is a whole other different fun problem that I'm not even going to try to address now, but that is going to be a very real issue that I don't know how to address. When you can fractionalize NFTs, like and then use them for trading, like it creates an ecosystem where you're not just trading baseball cards, but you're using like Monets to pay for Lamborghinis or something, like the equivalent of that in the NFT space. I have no idea if anyone's tokenizing Lamborghinis, but that's just meant to demonstrate like using an asset to pay for another. That's going to be really interesting. But when the instrument definitely is known as like, this is the way that you are paying to get access to this service or this good, that means that you have now commingled this non-financial activity with this financial activity. I would like the financial apparatus and regulatory framework, whatever that ends up looking like, whether it's the existing framework or something different where the activity may be like truly decentralized, asterisk, assuming that true decentralization is achievable, then a new regulatory framework imposed on the financial aspect. And then on the non-financial commercial one, I don't want the financial regulatory framework to be imposed on that. Like, we demand a different level of privacy and non-discoverability in internet activity and information transfer activity than we do in financial activity and certain commercial activity. So I do think that this is where standards around this could be technical features inside of the systems. It could be like certain metadata that's carried through with this asset to be able to validate whether or not this activity is financial in nature or not. I don't know. Like, these are all different possibilities that could be implemented in the space. And I think is going to have to be determined if people want to make a distinction on when what's happening is non-financial. They need to determine in their governance models how they're going, how like through governance and technological controls and features to be able to demonstrate which is happening. So I do think that I do view that a lot of this can be infrastructure. It being infrastructure does not inherently mean that it's not financial infrastructure. It can be financial infrastructure, can be financial institutions at times, and critical infrastructure also, whether it's information communications and technology infrastructure or financial infrastructure, both of them are captured underneath our definitions of critical infrastructure, which carries a bunch of other fun potential obligations, certainly coordination frameworks, definitely authorities for information sharing and other things too. But there's actually some ongoing rulemakings right now that are coming up for infrastructure providers, and I don't see the sector paying attention to this very much. Largely because the people that are paying attention, they're watching for financial regulatory action, right? Because that's what they're afraid of. They're not paying attention to the agencies that administer requirements for non-financial activity in which they say that they are. And I get it, like it's a part of the maturity and evolution that the space is going through. But there's KYC obligations that are being imposed on infrastructure as a service providers right now by the Department of Commerce. And that was pursuant to an executive order issued by President Trump and then upheld by President Biden. And knowing that those two gentlemen, current and former president, do not agree on lots of things, I don't know if that's going to go away, but that's certainly something that I want the sector to be alerted to, because I did not see the sector engaged very much in that notice and comment period at all for the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking. The current rulemaking is open and is asking for comments, and I hope that the sector engages, because I think if you read the definition of infrastructure as a service provider, I don't see how that doesn't cover layer ones. Like, so other than the question about finding the person to impose the obligation or responsibility on, which is just an issue for every regulation, I think it's very possible that blockchain layer ones are covered there. And I do think that they would be covered by cyber incident reporting requirements that critical infrastructure providers are going to have to do, that the Department of Homeland Security is currently administering. So there's a lot of things going on. For like, infrastructure does not mean that you're off limits and outside of bounds of all regulation. It is different regulation, although right now they're adopting things like Know Your Customer, which is sort of being imported from the financial space framework. But so hopefully that highlights that I do think that it's fair that some of this is, that a lot of this is infrastructure. Some of that may still mean that it's financial infrastructure and maybe a financial institution, depending on how it's operating. And even for the non-financial infrastructure, there's certainly a lot of frameworks for governance that we've learned and currently exist for multi-stakeholder governance of the internet. And there is other responsibility that's currently being pursued by both parties in the United States to impose more obligations on like social media providers in a way that, like, if both parties are seeking more accountability for those who are hosting platforms for user-generated content, I don't see the ecosystem for infrastructure provider to get people away from regulatory interest and oversight.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. So when we're looking at this type of um, regulation or rulemaking or legislation, whatever it might be, what are your thoughts on this, ongoing debate between how a centralized system versus a decentralized system would be defined?
Yeah, this is the toughest issue, and you're clearly monitoring all of the emerging issues that are plaguing policymakers, especially on the Hill right now. I I sit as the chair of the Technology Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commodities Trading Futures Commission, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, excuse me, CFTC. We just published under a subcommittee for digital assets and blockchain technology. We just published an 80-page report on DeFi, decentralized finance. I know you guys know what DeFi is. This we sought out specifically to try to help answer the question as best as we could about what is DeFi, because this is an issue that is plaguing policymakers internationally. It's something that even the FATF, the International Standards Body for Anti-Money Laundering, has been looking at and thinking about, and certainly US policymakers have. First, I will say that the reason why they're interested in that is because of the labels that industry has given itself. And there is confusion about this label. To big banks, they might view Coinbase as DeFi, but to DeFi devs, Coinbase is absolutely not DeFi, and it is DeFi. So the context of like who is saying this and talking about it is important.
Mhm.
Understanding your audience and talking about real DeFi, and this gets into the heart of what was in the report that we published. There's a 10-page executive summary if you want to read that instead of all 80 pages, although they are a great 80 pages. But Of course. But it was a great group, including a lot of crypto companies that participated as a part of this subcommittee and drafting this report. But what we highlighted is that DeFi is it's not something that is inherently, it's not inherently a binary, and it's not a one size fits all. Basically, DeFi exists on a spectrum and also on many dimensions. So really, it's not just one axis of a spectrum of like centralized to decentralized, and that maybe there's one point of
Sufficient
decentralized.
decentralization, as they like to say. Yeah.
Exactly, and as regulators might call the arbitrage line. Yes, so either the arbitrage line or the sufficient decentralization, but that is actually multiple axes, I would say. So whether it's operational axes, we defined five functional functional dimensions, including operations, access, development, governance, and then on the technological side, we highlighted things like open source technology, use of DAOs, et cetera. We painted the fact that these dimensions are all separate parts of determining how decentralized something is. There are things that can be very decentralized in one of those dimensions and not very much in another, like that have a much broader community of devs, but maybe the access is permissioned, or maybe the other way around, where it's permissionless, but actually there's a couple of core devs and people that are really the players that are pushing commit more than anybody else, and proposing changes, who are serving really as the administrators of that system. So that fact that we wanted to clarify up front, that like it's not easy to do a one size fits all. It's kind of impossible to do a one size fits all approach towards DeFi. And then also painting what the potential positives are and the risks are. Part of the argument that comes between centralized and decentralized is that inherently one is riskier than the other, that decentralized is riskier than centralized. Some of those features is not right. So, a good example is permissionless versus permissioned systems. Permissionless systems might be riskier from an anti-money laundering perspective, because anybody can participate with no controls that have been built in to prevent who gets access to the system. But they also could be less risky to cyber attacks and controls because of its greater decentralization. So the nature of the risk changes depending on which specific feature that we're talking about. So we highlighted the need for policymakers to be specific about which risks they mean, and to understand specifically which features of different systems that are all not one size fits all, and that they are like one is not like the other, that they need to be specific in understanding and examining the risks for each of them. So all of that, like highlighting the need for specificity, was in there, and I think that those are the core issues that are at play in like decentralized versus centralized. The biggest risk that does exist in decentralization that does not exist in centralization is this ambiguity and lack of clear lines of responsibility and accountability. This is the one feature that it doesn't really change like with other features that come in for decentralization. The absence of these clear lines of accountability and responsibility are the core issue that I feel that the industry needs to resolve and determine where they want accountability and responsibility to exist in the ecosystem. If you don't mitigate risk at the application layer, which is a preferred place to put it, like I prefer regulation at the application layer. They're the closest to the consumers, they're making all the money, like we like those intermediaries. But the reasons why policymakers are so concerned about decentralization and this issue right now is because application layer controls have not sufficiently mitigated the risk so far. Now, I feel that if you actually internationally implement the right application layer controls, like under the FATF standards, if you actually implemented them, so not just in policy that they're a requirement, but actually put them into practice, I think that you would buy a lot of time for DeFi to figure out how they want to mitigate controls, because you would have enough risk mitigation at the application layer that you wouldn't be concerned. You have policymakers concerned about DeFi right now because they're seeing that despite this being on a public ledger, North Korea is still successfully compromising these systems and successfully laundering. It being on a public ledger is not stopping that from happening. And also, like, there's a lot of other features like obfuscation mechanisms, et cetera, that play a role in all of that. But basically, again, a lot of this means like that the industry and international countries need to implement more frameworks on the more centralized players, which I think will buy everybody time to mitigate the risks that are presented by DeFi, and that's the biggest issue right now, is not seeing meaningful progress on that centralized issue. But hopefully that helps explain why people are so focused on DeFi at the moment, that I think that regulating DeFi is absolutely on the table, and that our report laid out a framework that we think policymakers could use in considering where to impose it. And also that it's tough to come up with this like clear line of sufficient decentralization. So it'll have to be, it's something that policymakers need to figure out how to envision, like what should the controls be in a decentralized system. How are they going to think about that, like what that kind of amorphous area is between centralization and decentralization, and where the accountability should sit.
Thank you for that answer. That was really great. I agree that um, focusing on the application layer is where we should be thinking about, who's responsible. It just makes so much more sense, like you were saying. And I really appreciate the nuance that you went into in terms of thinking about these different layers and kind of the spectrum of decentralization. And like you were saying, there's some systems that are decentralized and permissionless, but only a few people are really functionally responsible. And then the invert, like that's so important to think about all of that nuance. You've kind of mentioned several times now about standards, and I really love standards and think that they're like the key to, how we got to the web that we have today, in some ways the best parts of it anyway. Um, but I think I'm thinking about them differently than you are, right? Like I'm thinking about like technical standards that go into the W3C and have like, people like decide like, okay, like this is how, the schema looks for this kind of object or whatever it might be. So what are you talking about when you're talking about standards?
Uh, um, Also a great and very nuanced point, because you're right. Standards, the standards that are created at the FATF, again, I mentioned the Financial Action Task Force, or the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, or the International Organization for Securities Commissions, IOSCO. Those standards look very different from what comes out of ISO, the International Standards Organization, or W3C. So I do mean all of the above. I actually feel I've really appreciated the opportunity to get close with. There's a blockchain governance initiative. Begin is a standards
Mm.
body that's really chaired and administered out of Georgetown University, where I'm a senior fellow there. It's my alma mater for grad school, and so I've been excited because there's some really brilliant people that are working there, and they've been helping to run and administer this blockchain governance initiative that's focused on standards. And they've kind of bucketed it into three different areas, which is policy standards, operational standards, and technical standards. And I very much appreciate that, because that's right.
Mhm.
Like standards are meant to be, are standardized best practices and things that allow for features like greater efficiency, security, interoperability, et cetera. Like standards are wonderful, and like you've mentioned, have set the stage for fixing a lot of the problems from the original internet, which wasn't necessarily built initially with things like trust and security in mind. But standards growth, the industry rose to the occasion to help provide solutions to help address some of those weaknesses, and that's very much what's needed in this space. In fact, the first industry-driven standard that I knew of, which was more of a technical standard, or at least it was a technical feature standard, was the IVMS 101 standard. It was the InterVasp messaging, I think, standard. Yeah, IVMS, which was meant to be, so VASP, first off, means virtual asset service provider. I love all the different terms we've come up with at every single body of virtual asset, crypto asset. They all mean different things, but
Acronyms within acronyms, my goodness.
I won't bore you with that taxonomy of like why some people use virtual asset, digital asset, crypto asset, because they do all mean slightly different things. But basically, like what that means is like from the Coinbases to the Krakens of the world, that they are VASPs. And so this was meant to enable like a Swift message, basically for them to send information to each other to understand who is on either side of a transaction and to share critical info with each other that allows for things like sanction screening and complying with anti-money laundering controls. It's actually a policy standard that institutions do this, but then there's a standard for Swift messages at the ISO, which is more of a technical standards body. And this was the crypto industry again rising to the occasion to organize, which is hard for a decentralized community to do. But it was mostly the exchanges that were doing it because that's who like would be transmitting these messages. And they came up with an agreed standard about what fields and information to send, about how you represent names transliterated across different languages. Like how to share information about transaction hashes and crypto addresses. So I've seen the industry has already come up with standards. There is work happening at the ISO on blockchain standards as well. And W3C, of course, has done verifiable credential standards for enabling decentralized identity for years. So I think that all of them play really important roles, and we do need standards growth on all of them. I think that technological ones that meet and look to things like operational standards and policy standards that are meant to be the best practices and regulatory obligations as a way for technologically to build in dynamic and consistent and early compliance and security. That's how it works, right? Policy and operational needs are the requirements to engineers that are developing. So we need those standards bodies to grow in their efforts focused on blockchain, on not only financial applications, but on the infrastructure applications that you mentioned, to learn the lessons from Web 2 and try to build in that. Like, my understanding of the technical standards for key management is that like 60% of them are useful in the blockchain ecosystem, but that there's still some key gaps on technological standards for key management that will help to improve in a DeFi sector security of keys. I've not been able to get into the weeds of specifically what is missing in our key standards, but those are some examples of like where I think that standards need to exist across all those spectrums. So I'm really glad that you brought up that that nuanced understanding that like standards look different depending on which aspect we're talking about.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So are there thoughts on standards? Like, is there something like that you're particularly interested in when it comes to the standards process or problems that need to be solved?
Absolutely. I love the identity ones. I'm really glad that you brought up W3C. Even outside of crypto, identity is a huge issue that I've been a part of and seen. If you work in cybersecurity and if you work in financial crime, you see that identity is a major culprit in both of these things. We've seen multiple reports from cyber threat firms that like in 95% of ransomware instances, stronger identity management would have prevented the ransomware incident and that exploit from occurring. And in financial crime, most financial crime involves some kind of identity exploitation. It's a lack of understanding the nature of that person's identity, whether it's their risk profile, or in many instances, things like just fraudulent identities. And in crypto especially, it's the absence of identity being built into or considered in these ecosystems that made them so attractive as like a cyber criminal's favorite way to pay for cyber exploits and to launder their proceeds on the back end. Like, there's a reason why these are still a favored tool for use by illicit actors. It's not inevitable to be that way. Tech can solve this problem. Implementation of tech and standards will solve this problem. But so basically, I think that identity plays a really key role here, and the standards work that's happening at W3C or at other organizations like FIDO, I think are really important, and that I need and hope that this sector will look to and account for. I've seen a lot of excitement about identity in Web3, but some of those issues aren't advocating for the fixes that the traditional identity sector is calling for, because Web3 sometimes can have a sense of exceptionalism. I realize the banks can do this too, but like there can be a sense of exceptionalism that no, we can't possibly learn lessons from traditional spaces. But there is a traditional identity community that is calling for changes that have been needed for years, because if we don't fix those, then Web3 is just going to import into an ecosystem with less responsibility and accountability all the fun problems from traditional identity and finance, and will suffer the same pervasive fraud and synthetic identities that exist in TradFi. So I hope that they'll look to identity standards. That's an area that I'm especially interested in. Better anything regarding better cybersecurity practices. So cybersecurity can mean a lot of different things. It can mean better identity. It can mean better key management. It can mean good practices for mitigating your risk based on the consensus mechanism that you're operating from. But I think that cybersecurity is a major problem in this space. When DeFi is targeted, it is inherently a financial crime. Like that, when they're targeting DeFi, they're trying to target the financial assets. Exchanges have been targeted for both the financial assets and the identity data to be exfiltrated and monetized at a later date. But with DeFi, especially, that's not holding like that kind of information. It's just being targeted for the money. Like cybercrime going after DeFi is financial crime. So the sector needs to focus a lot on, I feel, cybersecurity standards. And then on the more operational side, on incident response and recovery. Like I mentioned with DeFi, I feel that cybercrime ends up being both technological in nature as well as financial in nature. That means that after a cyber incident, as compared to other institutions where, like with recovery operations, normally from a cyber incident, from a cyber nerd perspective, we're thinking about reconstituting the actual business operations. Hopefully, I had some business continuity planning and backups and things that I could move systems to. Certainly for DeFi, normally that means patching whatever like vulnerability was existing in the smart contract, or whatever software and protocol was being exploited. So there's that technological fix that needs to be put into place, which involves interesting governance implications depending on which system we mean. But then you also have the financial aspect. We like I mentioned before, we should be able to dare criminals to launder on a public ledger for fear of getting caught, and yet it remains a favored means of laundering by cyber criminals, and it's increasingly being used by other transnational threats. That shouldn't be the case. We absolutely the sector should not be allowing this to happen, and I absolutely believe that they can do this together. So that means standards and practices around cyber indicator and information sharing, illicit finance indicator and information sharing, which does not exist. I'm not aware of any standard that exists in the traditional space where there's standards around illicit finance info sharing. There is for cyber indicators. Styx and Taxi are a great example of that. Oasis is a standards body that basically has helped to create the standards for the language for sharing cyber threat indicators of compromise. A lot of those IOCs, indicators of compromise, can be used by the crypto and DeFi space to help, because they're getting pwned in a lot of the same ways that traditional spaces are. But also, I feel that those standards could be adapted or come up with a whole new one to include financial indicators. Like crypto is made perfectly with lots of structured digital information to enable instantaneous machine-to-machine like relay and sharing of information that should be able to allow for entire networks to know whether something is sus. So I think that's a huge area that needs to be focused on.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah. I completely agree with your perspective that technological solutions will be superior to policy solutions to these problems. And so, like let's get after it, make it happen. Let's see. I want to talk about AI, but first I want to get your thoughts on a CBDC and it's so controversial. What are your thoughts on that?
I know you like hard problems, Amy. I can tell. Well, I guess that's clear from your other podcasts too. So you're right. Central bank digital currencies are extremely controversial, and in a way that in a similar way to noise that I feel is happening in the crypto discussion, I'm seeing the same thing with CBDCs. If you'll allow me to be a little hyperbolic, On one side of the aisle, you have people saying the government shouldn't do money. That would be crazy. You should only, trust giant corporations that have definitely always proven themselves to be worthy of managing your sensitive assets and information, and that have not been properly regulated to appropriate standards yet. And then on the other side, you have vilification of systems that want to make money and that inherently hold some of the potential to achieve exactly the objectives that you outline, for things like decentralizing the financial system and putting control back into the hands of consumers, and belief that Americans will open up an account with your friendly neighborhood central bank. That is so again, that's a cheeky description where I find that the most extreme views on either side, one, vilifying CBDCs and saying privately administered cryptocurrency above all, and on the other side saying CBDCs only, private crypto should not be permitted. These do not, neither of them are I think, terribly practical or pragmatic, and they don't understand the positive potential for each. Note that I am on the advisory board for the Digital Dollar Project, so my particular feelings are not a secret on CBDCs, that I do think that the U.S. needs to be involved in experimentation for central bank digital currencies. There's a huge amount of potential for growth in cross-border and for greater cross-border efficiency and cost minimizations, as well as greater timeliness for cross-border payments and settlement systems. That it's taken us a long time to implement something like FedNow in the U.S., and that's only a domestic use case. I think that there's a lot of reasons why our international partners have been seeking and searching for ways to improve greater efficiencies and modernizing the financial system. CBDCs can be an answer to that. I think that wholesale is an obvious use case, and one that I think is likely to be adopted, maybe not globally, but certainly with certain countries. And it's definitely an area that we need to be involved in and participating in the pilots and experimentations that are being driven by places like the BIS Innovation Hub. A retail CBDC. So this means consumer facing, I've got a digital dollar in my wallet. So I think that is much harder and very, very sticky it's a very sticky and tough issue in the US. I don't think that is a likely outcome in the near term. However, I would still desire for the US to be involved in experimentation around it, because first off, I think that it will take at least a decade for the kind of research and development that it will take to assess and examine different operational, governance, and technological implementations. And either way, other countries are looking to implement retail CBDCs. Others have already, and it would be nice if we could at least paint standards, technological and policy ones. We've already issued some policy principles at the G7 level to highlight what a freedom coin template might look like, and something that gives a lot of developing nations, especially in the global South, an example to look to that isn't the Chinese example. I want the US to be more engaged and more forward-leaning on this. I do not think that implementation of a retail CBDC is likely at all in the near term, nor do I think that is on the mind of people at the Fed in a very prioritized way. And in the sense that I don't think that the narrative from certain people on the Hill who feel that the Fed just wants to implement a retail CBDC, I don't think that that's accurate. I think that I think that they're interested in looking and experimenting, and also that they feel confident that we can watch other countries with their experimentations first, and that there's a reason why the US has the most to lose, because we have the biggest footprint in this system and a great amount of responsibility, so they will play it more conservatively. I do hope that we play more in pilots and experiments, though. Rolling something out would be a huge undertaking. And unfortunately, a lot of the bans that are being pushed by certain members of Congress are not distinguishing between wholesale and retail. And they also have not noted the fact that the Fed has stated very clearly that they have no intention of rolling out a CBDC without the full support of Congress. And I completely believe them in that. Those members should consider how long it took FedNow to come into place. It would take a long time for a CBDC to be determined. So I do want experimentation, and I actually think that the building blocks for CBDCs, things like digital identity, you can't get digital money right and a digital economy right without fixing identity. They're helpful not just for CBDCs. there are helpful standards for stablecoins and for other parts of the crypto ecosystem also. So these are not mutually exclusive things. The future digital economy and financial system probably involves a mix of all of these things together. So I think the absence of nuance, which is somewhat just reinforced by the state of politics today, that's not, it's not accounting for the true reality of CBDCs or of cryptocurrency.
Okay, interesting. Um, okay, so really quick, let's touch on AI and then we have to wrap up. So I agree with you that AI and Web3 like need each other. That AI is rocket fuel for Web3 and that Web3 is what can make AI safe. Do you agree? I mean, we were talking about this before we started recording, so I'm kind of maybe putting words in your mouth there. Would you agree with that? And do you have things you want to add to that?
Yeah, overall, I think that captures a lot of the issues that are at play with the convergence of these two. And like you mentioned, we were talking about it before. I just came from the Japan FinTech Festival where I was speaking on this as a mega trend, and that I think that blockchain and crypto do reinforce each other's best and worst features in really interesting ways. So, like you said, the ability to do things like provide auditability and data integrity and provenance can help solve some of the problems with AI that you have for transparency and explainability. That is like these two things. I hope that blockchain will rise to the occasion and present itself as helping and being serving as one of the answers to the problems that AI is currently facing and why there's so much interest in regulation of AI right now. And I will say that generally I don't like regulation of general purpose technologies. That's not something that I like. That's why I don't support like a blockchain regulator. I support, we tend to regulate by application, financial, healthcare, whatever. Like that's normally how we regulate in the US. One of the major exceptions that I do see though, when we tend to regulate the tech itself, is when it can be a munition. And I feel that that's sort of the argument in the artificial intelligence executive order that the president just issued in, I think, October last year, that was invoking the Defense Production Act and highlighting that with human level capacity, with human level capacity in these highly sophisticated, democratized access AI models, you get human level capacity of really great things and wonderful commercial and economic developments and areas for growth, but also of chem, bio, rad, nuclear design capability and of command and control and coordination of malicious cyber operations. That strikes a very real chord for me as a former chemical officer and as a cyber person. So I understand why the administration and other nations and other jurisdictions like the EU are pursuing regulation of AI. I'll be curious to see what sort of balance that they strike. With this, some of it is that KYC for infrastructure providers regulation that I mentioned before. But I think that, so with this major interest in regulating the tech itself, I'm hoping that another technology like blockchain can help solve some of those core issues to ensure things like safety and mitigate against bias and discrimination. In order to get all those right, you first have to get the explainability piece right. And that's where I think that DLT could serve an answer here. On the other side of reinforcing some of the badness of AI, like the absence of accountability and responsibility and the ability to take things down if there isn't a responsible player for a decentralized system also presents a really scary possibility. It's funny. I asked. I was in that governance discussion that I mentioned at Begin, and we were talking about this issue, and I decided I would ask ChatGPT how it would feel about me taking it down if it was deployed across a decentralized network and it had been co-opted for malicious purposes. And its response was how I felt about it, which is like that my ability to take it down would depend on its security features, how decentralized it was. And like, yes, this is exactly like some of the worst features are enhanced by each other, but also the best features, AI solving the scalability problems of blockchain and being able to support things like compliance and supporting cybersecurity and detection of illicit activity. Like both of these things can help to support the bad features of each other, but also I think support the goods.
Interesting. Okay. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I know that's the most DC thing to say, but I am on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to reach out. I'm also still doing work at the Atlantic Council and at Terranet Ventures. So please feel free to reach out to me there and engage if you guys are interested in any of the research that we've been doing. But it's been wonderful to chat with you, Amy. These were a lot of really fun topics that I think are the core emerging issues that need to be addressed in the space.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. Your nuance is really refreshing. I mean, your deep understanding and nuance is just really, really refreshing and wonderful to hear and to know that we have people like you working on these problems in DC. I thank you for your work. Um, the final question is the name of our podcast. What kind of internet do you want?
um, Secure, trustworthy, interoperable, consumer focused.
Yeah,
Probably.
great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's in his own